We're talking about Yitzhak, that's our topic, okay? I did with Seminary Beis Yitzhak class today. I'm going to do another class with them Thursday. I'm doing with you something different. In other words, I'm not repeating. I'm doing different topics with each group. Here's a story which was found in the Sikha from the Previous Rebbe that was carried by a Chossid whose name was Harav Meir Ashkenazi, who happened to be in New York when the Previous Rebbe passed away and the period thereafter, and he actually came to our Rebbe and showed him the Sikha in the original hand in the Ksav Yad Kodesh of the Previous Rebbe. Here's a story, try this on for size. The Alter Rebbe had a Chossid whose name was Reb Nechemya de Brovne. Reb Nechemya de Brovne was actually a businessman by profession. He was a Gon Olam, he knew the whole Torah. He and the Tzemach Tzedek had been chavrusis for a time. And there's a very, very famous thing that when the Mittel Rebbe was Rebbe, he didn't write the Tshuvas and Nigla. The Alter Rebbe used to write Tshuvas and Nigla, Tzemach Tzedek wrote Tshuvas and Nigla. The Rebbe RaShaB wrote Tshuvas and Nigla a little bit. But the Mittel Rebbe Kvayochel didn't have time to write Tshuvas and Nigla. So the Tzemach Tzedek used to write the Tshuvas and Nigla. His partner, his Shutif, was Reb Nechemya de Brovna. They were probably the same age. Maybe the Nechemya was a little bit older. When the Mittel Rebbe passed away, and the Tzemach Tzedek became Rebbe, Reb Nechemya de Brovna did not go to Lubavitch. He couldn't see the Tzemach Tzedek as a Rebbe. He saw the Tzemach Tzedek as his friend, as a Chavrusa. He had gone to the Alter Rebbe as a Chossid to a Rebbe. He had gone to the Mittel Rebbe as a Chossid to a Rebbe. But to the Tzemach Tzedek, he felt like he cannot go, so he didn't go. He had a dream. He saw the Alter Rebbe in a dream. And the Alter Rebbe said to him, Nechemya, was hast du nicht kein Rebbe? By the way, he wrote Charles the Tshuvas Divrei Nechemya. He wrote a sefer of responsa, Charles Divrei Nechemya, which is very important, halacha sefer. He has a sefer to the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. He's a very, very important Chabad Chossid, Lubavitcher Chossid from the angle of Nigla. He's known in the world. He's a very big, he was a Gadol B'Yisrael. Rabbi Nechemya de Brovna. So he had a dream. He sees the Alter Rebbe in a dream, and the Alter Rebbe says to him, why don't you have a Rebbe? Why don't you have a Rebbe? So he says, why don't I have a Rebbe? I don't have a Rebbe because my Rebbe passed away. It's very simple, right? The Mittel Rebbe was nostalgic. He didn't see the Tzemach Tzedek as his Rebbe, so he didn't go to Lubavitch. And the Alter Rebbe said, you need to have a Rebbe. And he told him as follows. For in Lubavitch to host a Rebbe. Go to Lubavitch, you have a Rebbe. And then he added, Menachem beheve, Menachem be'osid. Menachem in the present, Menachem in the future. You hear? The Alter Rebbe told Reb Nechemya the Rebbe Nacholim that he should go to Lubavitch, he has a Rebbe, and then he added Menachem now, Menachem later. This Chossid, Reb Meir Ashkenazi, had this Sikha, the original, the Ksav Yad Kodesh. When the Previous Rebbe passed away and the Rebbe didn't want to be a Rebbe, he came to 770 and he didn't give it to the Rebbe. He showed the Rebbe the Sikha, that the Rebbe should see with his own eyes. That the Previous Rebbe wrote with his own hand a story that goes back till the Alter Rebbe. Menachem behave, Menachem be'asad, Menachem now, Menachem in the future. This is the first story. This is the Shalom Aleichem to today's class. The second story is the following. The Tzemach Tzedek had 7 sons and 2 daughters. The Mittel Rebbe had 7 daughters and 2 sons. Tzemach Tzedek had 7 sons and 2 daughters. Of the 7 sons of the Tzemach Tzedek, here's what happened to them. One of them passed away before him. His name was Rabbi Yankiv. He was a Rav in Aral. Rabbi Yankiv. Which leaves 6. 7 minus 1 is 6. Of the remaining 6, 5 became Rebbes, or Gute Eden. 5. The youngest, the Rebbe Marash, was the Rebbe in Lubavitch. He was Mamalim and Mekayim Kachi. He sat on the seat of the Rebbe the Tzemach Tzedek. He was the Previous Rebbe's Malam. 3 others became Chabad Rebbes, Chabad style Rebbes, in different cities. Rabbi Yehuda Leib, the Ma'aril, became a Rebbe in Kopust. Reb Chaim Shnei Zalman, the Machshaz, became a Rebbe in Liadi. And the Rabbi Sol Neach, the Ma'arin, became a Rebbe in Nezhin. 2 of these 3 dynasties lasted 50 years, till World War I, or even later. The Kopust dynasty ended in the 1920s. The Leadia dynasty ended in the 1910s. Tzemach Tzedek became a Rebbe in Tzemach Tzedek passed away in 1866. So that accounts for 5 of the 7 sons, right? 1 passed away, 4 became Chabad Rebbes. 1 became a Polish Rebbe, a Chagas Rebbe. His name was Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak. He was the Friedrich Rebbe's mother's father. The Friedrich Rebbe was named after him. He was the Rebbe in Avruch. And he, even though he was Tzemach Tzedek's Akint, he married into a mishpacha of Chernobyl, and he became what you would call a Polish Rebbe. His style of Chassidus was not Chabad, because the Chassidim in Avruch wouldn't suffer it. He became essentially a Polish Rebbe, which leaves 1. Okay, 1 passed away, 5 became Rebbes, and that leaves 1. You know which one? The oldest. The oldest name was Rebbe RaShaB, the Ravash. He had a right to the Nesius. Halachically, if a man has children and they're worthy, the oldest son has a din kedima to Yerusha. The Ravash was the oldest of the Tzemach Tzedek's children. You could have made a case that even in halacha, he should have been Mamale Mekem Kachif in the Tzemach Tzedek. The Ravash was a Balmum. The Ravash was not born complete. He was physically missing the pasayat, and his left hand ended in a stump. He didn't have fingers on his left hand. I think this is significant, but what I think I know isn't important, but I think it's significant. He knew the Alter Rebbe. The Ravash was a Chossid of the Alter Rebbe. The Maril was a Chossid of the Mittler Rebbe. The Ravash knew the Alter Rebbe, was very close to the Alter Rebbe. The Friedrich Rebbe writes about the Ravash that his whole life there was a sadness about him because he never recovered from the death of his great-grandfather, the Alter Rebbe, who passed away when he was the grand old age of 7. The Ravash was a big tzaddik and a big chossid and a big goan, and he lived his entire life in Lubavitch. When the mishpacha moved to Lubavitch, he was already a young man before Bar Mitzvah. He got Bar Mitzvah in Lubavitch, got married in Lubavitch, lived his life in Lubavitch, passed away in Lubavitch, and he's buried in the Beis Rivkah in Lubavitch, and there's a matzeva for him. He passed away, Tov Reish Chav Tes, he passed away 3 years after his father, the Tzemach Tzedek. The Ravash did not become a Rebbe. Why? So of course, the correct answer to that question is, I don't know. But one of the stories which is known in the mishpach of the Rebbe's family, that the Tzemach Tzedek, his father, the Tzemach Tzedek sold his oldest son. Although Pi Halacha, you have a right to succession, you have a right to be Mamala Mokum, I am telling you, do not be a Rebbe. He said to him, do not be a Rebbe. And if you do not become a Rebbe now, I promise you, Pishnayim, you'll get double. Everybody knows that a Bchor, an oldest son, gets double from everybody else. If you do not become a Rebbe, I promise you double. Twice as much as everybody else. And then the Tzemach Tzedek said something very cryptic. Tzemach Tzedek said, don't become a Rebbe, I promise you double. And then he said these words. V'dei revi yeshuvuhena. It'll come back to you in 4 generations. V'dei revi is a pasuk in Parshas Lech Lecha, when Hashem told Avraham Avinu about going into Golus, Mitzrayim, and coming back to Eretz Yisroel, Hashem said, V'dei revi yeshuvuhena k'lei shalom aveinu ameri adheina. It's going to take 4 generations for you to come back. So the Ravash, the Tzemach Tzedek's oldest son, did not become a Rebbe. He was a chassid of his youngest brother, who was literally 30 years younger than he was. The Rebbe Marash was 32, the Ravash was about 60, and the Ravash became a chassid of his youngest brother. He lived in Lubavitch, he passed away in Lubavitch, and he's buried in Lubavitch Beis Alman, and you can go to Lubavitch and see his cave. I don't know if they have it in the right place, but they certainly made a marker for him, the Ravash. And he told this Messiah to his children. In the Ravash's mishpacha, which is a large mishpacha, the tradition was known that Tzemach Tzedek had promised that the Nesius was going to come back to them, and they were going to get double, but it would take 4 generations. The Ravash had a son whose name was Levi Yitzchak. Levi Yitzchak had a son whose name was Baruch Shnei Zalman. Baruch Shnei Zalman had a son whose name was Levi Yitzchak, otherwise known as Levik. And Levik's oldest son was the Rebbe, our Rebbe. Understand that the Mishpacha knew this. There were other branches of the family that also felt that they were entitled to Nesius. I'm not going to say names because it can get political, because they all knew that in 4 generations the Nesius is coming back to them. The Rebbe is not the 4th generation of Tzemach Tzedek, he's the 5th. The Rebbe Levik, there's a shmua that the Rebbe Levik felt he should be a Rebbe. When the Rebbe was engaged to be married to the Friedrich Rebbe's daughter, so Levik said, the Rebbe Levik said, I made a mistake. The 4 generations don't start with the Tzemach Tzedek, they start with the Ravash. So if the 4 generations start with the Ravash, so it's Levi Yitzchak, Baruch Shner, Levi Yitzchak, and then the Rebbe. So this is the second story that links our Rebbe to the Nesias, to the Rabbistva. Now the third story is the Rebbe was born in Nikolaev. The Rebbe was not born in Dnipropetrovsk, in Yekaterinburg. The Rebbe was born in Nikolaev. The Rebbe spent the first 7 years in Nikolaev. Nikolaev was a large city, but it was a very, very Chassidish city. The Rebbe as a child knew many, many great Chassidim. The Rebbe knew the Altoises, the Rebbe knew the Korfs, otherwise known as the Charatonovs. There were a lot of the great Chassidim living in Nikolaev, and of course the Rebbe's grandfather, the Rebbe's mother, Rebbetzin Chaya's father, the Meir Shleima Halevi Yanovsky, was the Nikolaev Rav, the Rav of Nikolaev. And the Rebbe was born in Nikolaev. On the day that the Rebbe was born, which is Yudalef Nisan Tafresh Samach Beis, the Rebbe RaShaB sent 6 telegrams from Lubavitch to Nikolaev. 6. On the same day. The day the Rebbe was born, there were 6 telegrams sent from Lubavitch to Nikolaev. The Rebbe's mother was once interviewed, and she told a lot of stories. And I haven't seen this interview. I read the interview probably 40 years ago. But the way I remember it, that the Rebbe, the one reason those telegrams were sent is because the Rebbe was born. It was a big sakana. The giving birth to the Rebbe was not a simple affair, and the telegrams had to do with Pashat Brius, Zachen von Yerufua. But I also understand that in those telegrams there were instructions about how to treat the baby. The Rebbe's parents, Rebbe's mother, was told when the Rebbe was born that he should always wear a yarmulke. The Rebbe wore a yarmulke from his bris, girls. The Rebbe wore a yarmulke from his bris. And the Rebbetzin Chaya said that was a direct instruction from the Rebbe RaShaB. We did not get that same instruction for our other 2 boys, just for the Rebbe. The Rebbe wore a yarmulke from his bris. The Rebbetzin Chaya was instructed by the Rebbe RaShaB that every time she nurses the Rebbe, she has to wash Negel Wasser herself and wash Negel Wasser the little baby. And you know, you guys are girls, so you'll be mothers one day, and you probably saw your mothers. When you'll have a baby, not your first maybe, but your second, and for sure your third, you're going to sleep with the baby. The baby's going to wake up in the middle of the night and cry. You're going to nurse the baby. You're not even going to know you're nursing. You're going to be sleeping because you're going to be so tired. The Rebbe, what wash Negel Wasser? You just keep on sleeping. The Rebbe's mother was instructed every single time she nursed the Rebbe, she had to get up. She had to wash her hands Negel Wasser in the middle of the night. And she had to wash the baby's hands Negel Wasser. And again, the Rebbetzin said those instructions it did not get for their other children. They were also instructed to be very careful about ayin hara, that people shouldn't see the Rebbe and people shouldn't talk about this child, this wunder kind.
I think the relation between the Rabbi and the Rebbe RaShaB.
The Rebbe's great-grandfather, whose name was Levi Yitzchak, and the Rebbe RaShaB were first cousins. That meant that the Previous Rebbe and the Rebbe Levik's father were second cousins. Because the Ravash was the oldest, the Rebbe Marash was the youngest. There was 30 years between the oldest and the youngest. So there's almost a generation and a half between the Ravash and the Rebbe Marash. So there's a lot of space. In other words, Rebbe Levik and the Rebbetzin Chaya Muzshka were third cousins. The Rebbe would have been a fourth cousin to his children had the Eibishter given him children. You understand? The Rebbe was never in Lubavitch. The Rebbe was 18 years old when the Rebbe RaShaB passed away. 18. And to Bar Mitzvah, the Rebbe was a Gaon Elam. The Rebbe's father said about the Rebbe to his Bar Mitzvah was a Gaon Elam. How could you have such a child and not send him to Lubavitch? He never saw the Rebbe RaShaB. Never. So there's a story which is in a sefer called Yemei Melech. The book Yemei Melech is the stories, all the stories that may be true. I don't know if the stories are true or not, but in the sefer Yemei Melech there's a story that somebody said to the Rebbe's mother, you have such kids, how do you not send them to Lubavitch? So the Rebbe's mother said, quote, about the Rebbe, he's ripping to go, he's desperate to go, and they're not letting him. Now who's they? Was government. Either the Rebbe RaShaB or his father or both. Somebody decided that Rebbe should not meet the Rebbe RaShaB. He never saw the Rebbe RaShaB. In fact, there's a printed sicha from the Previous Rebbe that when the Rebbe was a bacher, he and his brother Label used to come to Rostov and then let the guys from Previous Rebbe. They were bacher, they came as chassidim to a Rebbe. But they were anoshim chshuvim, they were very special. So they stood behind the Previous Rebbe. And at one fabrengen, the Previous Rebbe turned around to the two of them. And he said to them as follows. He says, Arachmanos of Eich Bechlal und auf dir befragt, was ihr nicht gekannt dem Taten. It's a Rachmanas on both of you, but especially you, the Rebbe, Ramash, that you didn't know my father. Years later, when the Rebbe was already a Rebbe, Rabbi Shmuel Levittin, who was a big Chossid, walked out of the Rebbe's room, shaking, white like a ghost. And he looked very, very disturbed. So Rabbi Groner, label, Alter Rebbe, said to Rabbi Shmuel, was ist geschehen? So Rabbi Shmuel told Rabbi Groner that the Rebbe hat mir jetzt gesagt, als sehr zufrieden was nicht kennt dem Rebbe nicht mehr sehen. That he's very happy that he never saw the Rebbe RaShaB. And Rabbi Shmuel couldn't believe someone would say that. The Rebbe just told that he's happy he never saw the Rebbe RaShaB. Es wurde gestellt zum Miskashes zum Schwer, it would have disturbed the Miskashes to the Frierdiker Rebbe. And the Rebbe says, I'm happy I never saw the Rebbe RaShaB. And by the way, the exact same thing happened to the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe was prevented with force to never meet the Baal Shem Tov. This is the way it needed to be, but the fact was the Rebbe should have seen the Rebbe RaShaB. There is no explanation. You can't explain it because of politics or war. It's a ruchniistic thing. The Rebbe was prevented from seeing the Rebbe Nishma Seiden. At 18 years old, the Rebbe was like an 80-year-old God, and Chossid, and Tzaddik, and Kodesh. He was not allowed to meet the Rebbe RaShaB. But the Rebbe RaShaB was having a conversation with the Frierdiker Rebbe, with his son, about the granddaughters. So the oldest daughter, Chana Gerari, the Rebbe chose the Chossid. The Rebbe RaShaB chose the Rashag. The Rebbe RaShaB chose the Rashag. Because Rashag, the Rebbe RaShaB said about Rashag, he's so into Chassidus that he's removed completely from the world. There's no Taivus. Rashag was geleg and kuli in Chassidus. The Rebbe Nishma Seiden said about the Rashag, I looked at Zeifel Chassidus, that he has no shaykhs to certain in Yanim Leitevim. And then he told the Frierdiker Rebbe, wegen the middle, about your middle daughter, darf des trachten wegen eine von Levik sehen. You have to think about one of Levik's sons. The Frierdiker Rebbe was told by his father, the Rebbe RaShaB, who is officially called the Shatchen, your middle daughter, you have to think about one of Levik's children. Now understand, the Rebbetzin Chaya Muzshka, the Rebbe RaShab's middle daughter, was a year older than the Rebbe. And the Rebbe was the oldest. So if she had married Label, she would have married a boy 4 or 5 years younger than her, which is kind of hard to imagine. I mean, anything could be, but I mean, Miriam married a guy who was, Yechev married a guy who was like 50, 60, 70 years younger than he was, and the shidduch worked out okay, they had nice kids. Moshe and Miriam, not bad. But Bepashtot, the Rebbe RaShaB made the shidduch. And you should know that when the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin were engaged, there was a lot of back and forth. Some of it I know, some of it I don't know, some of it I wish I didn't know, some of it's probably not true. But when the Rebbe got married, when the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin got married, the Frierdiker Rebbe sent a special telegram to a Chossid in Russia, go to Rostov, go to my father's Tzion, and tell my father that we did what he wanted. The Rebbe RaShaB wanted the Rebbetzin Chaya Muzshka to marry Eine von Levik's Zin. There was a lot of discussion about the shidduch. Now, the Rebbe went to the Frierdiker Rebbe. I don't know which came first. The Rebbe went to the Frierdiker Rebbe for 2 reasons. He went to the Frierdiker Rebbe as a chassid to a Rebbe, and he went to the Frierdiker Rebbe to look for a shidduch. The Rebbe was a B'yudis Chossid. There was a talk about a shidduch. The Rebbe traveled to the Frierdiker Rebbe and to the Frierdiker Rebbe's house, Pashat Kipshute, to meet the Rebbetzin Chaya Muzshka and to talk about the prospective shidduch. So I don't know whether the first time he went because of Chassidus, or the first time he went because of shidduch, but they're very, very closely related. In 1922-23, when the Rebbe was 20 years old, the Rebbe was 20, the Rebbe was 21, they were both young. The Rebbe was in Rostov, and the Rebbe also met the Rebbetzin Chaya Muzshka. They got married 6 years later. 6 years later, when they were both older. But the first time they met, they were quite young, relatively speaking. But the Rebbe went to the Frierdiker Rebbe as a chassid to a Rebbe. Now, I don't know how these things work, because I'm less than a nobody. I'm not even a nobody. But how do you become a chassid of a Rebbe? If you're the Rebbe and you have a father like Rebbe Levik? These are complicated prospects. The Rebbe was a his old man. He didn't need a Rebbe. That's number one. The Rebbe's father was a Gon Olam. The Rebbe's father was an incredibly great chassid, incredibly great tzaddik, incredible Eved Elokim, Rebbe Levik. But the Rebbe decided that the Rebbe Dayatz was Rebbe. Finished. His father is Tate and the Shver is Rebbe. How much time that took the Rebbe, we'll never know. But it's quite clear that pretty early on, the Rebbe figured out that to do the Tate and to do the Rebbe the Shver. The Rebbe, the father is my father, and the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe the Shver is my Rebbe. And the Rebbe was the Frierdiker Rebbe Chossid. The Rebbe's mother, Rebbetzin Chaya, told people many, many years later, Ich weiß, as is mehr dem Shver than the man. I know he belongs more to his father than he belongs to my husband. The Rebbetzin Chaya was not a fool. But the Rebbe, I don't know how quickly, Poshet became a Chossid of the Frierdiker Rebbes. And as a Chossid of the Frierdiker Rebbes, the greatest honor in the world you could have given the Rebbe is the Rebbe should be Zeicher to marry the daughter of the Frierdiker Rebbe. When the Rebbe spoke about the Rebbetzin Chaya Muzshka, when the Rebbetzin passed away, he didn't call her his wife. He called her Bite Shel Nasidereinu, the daughter of the Nasi Yadar. So the story was that the Rebbe met the Rebbetzin a few times. I don't know what happened next. I just know that the engagement took forever. Getting engaged took forever. Getting married took forever. There was a lot of back and forth. At the very end, of course, there was the question of the Rebbe's parents coming to the wedding, which the Russian government ultimately did not allow them to do, and the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin got married. And the Rebbe saw himself as an Eidim, as a son of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and for him this was everything. There's a letter from the Rebbe where the Rebbe writes about himself. Chosnik ibnoi. Chosnik ibnoi means a son-in-law is like a son. The Rebbe writes about himself. Chosnik ibnoi, a son-in-law is like a son. I'll tell you a very weird story, and it's taka weird story. It's taka weird story. When the Rebbe RaShaB passed away, the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away, so there were Lubavitchers in New York. And then there were Lubavitchers all over the world, in Eretz Yisroel, in Europe, in Australia. The Lubavitchers in New York had the job, had the task, which was a very unpleasant and scary, dangerous job, to make the Rebbe Rebbe. To make the Rebbe Rebbe, and that's exactly the story. Again, I'm much too young, but I've heard from people that you could say, even in the Astachten, that the Chassidim, Anash, changed the Rebbe's mind. The Rebbe said no, and Chassidim made the no into a yes. It was Mesiras Nefesh. It was very dangerous, because the Rebbetzin Chaya was handing out curses like you hand out candies, and you had to be very, very careful. You couldn't upset the Rebbe, you couldn't upset the Rebbetzin Chaya, you couldn't even upset the RaShaB, but you had to push it through that the Rebbe should become a Rebbe, and they saw to it that the Rebbe became a Rebbe. But there were Chassidim all over the world. They were writing letters. They were trying to find out what's going on. One of those Chassidim was a very great Chossid by the name of Reb Chaim Shol Brook. Reb Sheil, he was called. He was a big Gon, a big Lamda Nigla, a big Ovid, a big Chossid, a Tomim. He was really the real deal. He made Tzemach Tzedek in Eretz Yisroel. He was worked for the Rabbi. He was a dedicated soldier, Reb Sheil. And Reb Sheil wrote a letter to Jacobson, to Rabbi Jacobson, after Pesach of 1950. And in this letter, he writes a story that he heard from a Yid named Chanin. He writes the name of the person he heard it from. That in Tafresh Pei Aleph in 1921, the Rogatchover came to Rostov. The Rogatchover later lived in Leningrad. Leningrad is in the top of the world. Rostov is in the bottom of the world. The Rogatchover came to Rostov. Now remember, the Rogatchover was not a man who showed much honor to anybody. The Rogatchover didn't have respect for people. Remember also that the Rogatchover was older than the Rebbe RaShaB. He was older than the Frierdiker Rebbe's father, let alone the Frierdiker Rebbe. And he was matriach himself to come by himself to Rostov. The Frierdiker Rebbe was 40, 41. The Rogatchover was probably in his 60s. So they ran out to be makabel upon the Rogatchover. They gave him shalom, but they great derech eretz. And they ran into the Frierdiker Rebbe, but the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rogatchover came. When the Frierdiker Rebbe heard that the Rogatchover came, the Frierdiker Rebbe ran out to be makabel upon him, to give him shalom. So the Chassidim asked the Rogatchover, why did he come? Why did he come to the Frierdiker Rebbe? So he answered, quote, Ich bin gekommen geben dem Rebbe smicha. I came to give the Rebbe smicha. The Frierdiker Rebbe needs Rogatchover smicha. The Rogatchover and the Rebbe went into a room. They spent 4 hours together talking. Of course, the content of that conversation, nobody knows. But when the Rogatchover walked out, he made the following statement. Jeden darfen haben an Nossi. Befahrt as roidetu. Jeden need a Nossi, a Rebbe. The term Nossi, which the Rebbe used all the time, Nesidereinu. I think the Rogatchover coined that phrase. To call the Rebbe a Nossi B'Yisrael was, maybe I'm wrong. Yidden need a Nossi, especially since he's deserving. And then the Rogatchover said something very cryptic. A son-in-law comes before anybody else, and a son comes before anybody else. So the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away, and the Frierdiker Rebbe had no sons. So Reb Sheil wrote, maybe that the Rogatchover, without realizing it, like a shtickle nevuah, when he said 29 years earlier, it was a remiss to the fact that after the Frierdiker Rebbe, the next Rebbe is going to be an Eidim, the next Rebbe is going to be a son-in-law. Derech Agav, I want to tell you something interesting and sweet. The Rebbetzin had childhood friends from Lubavitch. She didn't have too many friends, because not a lot of girls in Lubavitch. The Rebbetzin had childhood friends. They lived in Lubavitch. One of her childhood friends was a Marozov. There were two sisters. Marozov sisters. They both lived till over 100. They lived in Eretz Yisroel. They were very close. They were like one family. One of these two sisters, Marozov, came to America, and she met the Rebbetzin Chaya Muzshka, and they spent time. They talked. They spoke in Russian. They went back to their childhood. They had a good fun together. During the course of that conversation, the Rebbetzin says to her friend, her old childhood friend, do you remember what I told you as a child? Do you remember what I told you as a child? So this Marozov woman said to the Rebbetzin Chaya Muzshka, no, I don't remember. I can't remember what I told you as a child. So the Rebbetzin left it. When this Marozov girl walked out, she was a woman in her 80s. When she walked out of the Rebbe's house, the Rebbetzin Chaya Muzshka's house, she turned to the people who came with her and said, you think I don't know what she told me? I remember exactly what she told me. She told me my father has no sons, and after my father there's not going to be a Rebbe. The Rebbetzin Chaya Muzshka told her as a girl, my father's going to be a Rebbe, but after my father there's not going to be a Rebbe. A different yetz I heard was that she said to her friend, I don't want to be the wife of a Rebbe. I have two sisters, let them have it. I don't want to be the wife of a Rebbe, but it's always the one who don't want the job, don't get the job. This is an interesting little anecdote. Now, the Rebbe got engaged to the Rebbetzin Chaya Muzshka. He got very involved in the Frierdiker Rebbe's work. The KGB was looking for him. The Rebbe was such a chevra man. He was so smart and so shrewd and so wow. He left Russia. The Latvian government would not allow him to stay in Latvia, so he went to Berlin. One of the reasons the Rebbe had to study in school in Berlin is because he didn't have immigration rights. His rights to live in Berlin was as a student. He had a Russian passport, which was not very helpful, but he was a student in Berlin. And then, of course, the Rebbetzin married the Rebbe, and a year later she also moved to Berlin, and they lived in Berlin until the Nazis, Yamach Shmam, came to power. Now, during all these years, between 1928 and 1940-41, the Rebbe was away from the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Frierdiker was living in Riga, Latvia, and then later in France, in Warsaw and Tzemach Poland, and the Rebbe was living in Berlin and in Paris. There's actually a letter from Reb Chatzah Fagin, where he writes that the reason the Rebbe is not near the Frierdiker Rebbe because he wants to learn and daven undisturbed, and he knows that if he's going to be next to the Rebbe, he's not going to be able to learn and daven. So, Reb Chatzah wrote to Yisrael Jacobson that he should write a letter to the Rebbe to tell him to come to America and to promise that no one is going to bother him, even though the Rebbe needs him. The Rebbe was away from the Frierdiker Rebbe. One of the reasons was he wanted to learn and daven. But the Rebbe was very involved in the Frierdiker Rebbe's activities. He printed his Maimorim, he printed his Sichos. A lot of what we have from the Frierdiker Rebbe is Poshet Adaying the Rebbe. The Rebbe made it all happen. Okay? And then there are a few interesting stories that are clear remozim for Rebbe Eistver. In other words, when you say the Frierdiker Rebbe passes away and the Rebbe says, I don't know what you're talking about, it's just that simple. There are clear remozim that the Rebbe knew about Rebbe Eistver. First of all, the story I just told you, that Tzemach Tzedek promised his Elter Zayde that in 4 generations it would come back. The Rebbe wasn't a fool. But then here's another story which is really, really amazing. I heard the story from Yossi Kazen Alav Shalom, who heard it from Kozherminsky, heard it from Chaim Lieberman. Later I saw it printed in the book. Rav Zalman Gadol's Mishpacha printed it in his biography, which is called B'chol Beis Hinem, and you have the same story. That when the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin were dating, I mean, they didn't date 25 times, I promise you, and they didn't go to a hotel lobby and buy a Coke. They sat in the house and talked. Like normal people, but we're, Baruch Hashem, open-minded. Chas v'shalom, someone's going to see us, and then the whole world is going to come to an end. The Rebbe's mother came to Rostov. The Rebbetzin Chaya came to Rostov. She stayed in the house of the Frierdiker Rebbe for a couple of weeks. And she watched, she looked around, she wanted to check out the situation. And after a few weeks, she liked what she saw, she liked how the family is running, she liked how the Rebbetzin Chaya Muzshka behaves. She could be a kala for the Rebbe. And after she spent some time checking out the house and deciding if the Rebbetzin was a good shidduch for the Rebbe, she went into the Frierdiker Rebbe to a Yechidus. The Rebbe, our Rebbe's mother, went into the Frierdiker Rebbe to Yechidus and said, my husband told me that if I like what I see, I can agree to the shidduch. If I like what I see, and I like what I see, I'm prepared to agree to the shidduch. But he did make a condition with me, however. The condition was my husband insisted that I ask you for a nad. You have to promise me a dowry. So the Frierdiker Rebbe said, I have no money. The Rebbe's mother told the Rebbe Rayatz that she can agree to the shidduch with the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin on the condition that the Frierdiker Rebbe is going to give her money. Nad. So the Frierdiker Rebbe said, I have no money. So the Rebbetzin Chaya told the Frierdiker Rebbe, and I quote, Ich mein nicht Geld, ich mein Rabbeistve. I'm not asking for money, I'm asking for a promise of succession. Before the Rebbe was engaged, the Rebbe's mother told the Frierdiker Rebbe, you want this shidduch? Promise me he's the next Rebbe. And the Frierdiker Rebbe agreed. The Frierdiker Rebbe agreed. So the Rebbe's mother said, put it in writing. Put it in writing. And the Frierdiker Rebbe says, I cannot put it in writing. And again, I heard two different girses, one from Chaim Lieberman and one from Tzemach Tzedek. In the girsa from Chaim Lieberman, the Rebbe said, Chassidim will allein verstehen, Chassidim will understand themselves. And in the girsa of Zalman Gerari, the Frierdiker Rebbe said, by uns, a word is a word. By people like us, we give you our word, it's enough, you don't need to have a shtar, yishrim. So the Frierdiker Rebbe passes away. And the Rebbe is screaming that he's not meant to be a Rebbe. So Reb Zalman Gerari went over to the Rebbe and says, I don't understand you. I was in the house. When you were dating the Rebbetzin, I was a boy of 16, 17 years old. I was a big boy. He was a Yossi. Zalman Gerari was a Yossi, lived in the Frierdiker Rebbe's house. He was there when the Rebbe's mother came and when the Rebbe's mother negotiated that the condition of the shidduch is the Rebbe's going to be the next Rebbe. So he says to the Rebbe, what do you mean you're not going to be a Rebbe? I was in the house when your mother negotiated with the Frierdiker Rebbe that the condition of the shidduch is that you're going to be the next Rebbe. Now how do you get out of that, huh? I'm asking you. A witness comes, and by the way, he's not the only one who tells the story. There was a Yid who lived in New York whose name was Sender Reinen. He was very close to the Moshe Herson. He was also in the house in Pei Gimel in 1923 when the Rebbe's mother came. And he also knew the story. At the Frierdiker Rebbe agreed before the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin were engaged that the Rebbe's going to be the Malam Kem Kocha, the Frierdiker Rebbe. So they come to the Rebbe and say, what do you mean you don't want to be a Rebbe? This was negotiated before you were engaged. You know what the Rebbe answered? Does anybody know what the Rebbe answered? Ich hab nicht gehört von schwer. The Frierdiker Rebbe never told me. He didn't say it wasn't true. He just said, if I'm going to be Rebbe, I'm not going to do it because of my mother, or because of my father, or because of my great-great-grandfather. I'm going to do it because of my Rebbe. And until the Rebbe, the Shver, until the Frierdiker Rebbe tells me that I'm meant to be a Rebbe, it doesn't work. So the Rebbe knew these stories. Do me a favor. The Rebbe knew these stories. And then in the Rebbe's reshimos, the Rebbe's personal journal, which is now printed, you have inyanim that are clearly made Rebbe le-Rebbe. Clearly. The Rebbe knew them because the Rebbe had the journal. We found the journal after Gimel Tammuz. We didn't have it. But the Rebbe knew that they were, the Rebbe experienced these things. He wrote them down himself. I'm going to tell you several stories. One of the stories is that in the Rebbe's diary, it says that the Frierdiker Rebbe told the Rebbe that the Rabbeim were always careful to make Kiddush themselves. But they were not careful to make Havdala themselves. Havdala, they would even be Yitzhak from somebody else. With one exception. Matzah Yom Kippur, the Rabbeim made Havdala themselves. And then he added, and the person who was going to be the next Rebbe would take the leftover wine from the Havdala of the Rebbe and he would make Havdala himself. Okay, girls, listen. The Frierdiker Rebbe told this to the Rebbe. It's in the Rebbe's journal. That's how I know it. That the Rabbeim were medayek to make Kiddush themselves. But they were not medayek to make Havdala themselves. They were Yitzhak Havdala from somebody else also. Except Matzah Yom Kippur. Matzah Yom Kippur, the Rabbeim made Havdala themselves. And they would leave over a little bit of wine. And the son, who was going to be the next Rebbe, would take that leftover wine and fill it up with more wine and make Havdala himself. And then the Frierdiker Rebbe said to the Rebbe, take my wine, go into the other room so people shouldn't see, there shouldn't be any jealousy, and make Havdala yourself. I'm asking you, it's a proof or not a proof? The Frierdiker Rebbe told the Rebbe that the one who was going to be Malam Mokum would take the leftover wine and make Havdala. The Rebbe said to the Rebbe, it's in the Rebbe's journal. He said to the Rebbe, take my leftover wine, go into the other room, there shouldn't be any jealousy, and make Havdala yourself. The Rebbe didn't know this. The Rebbe knew this. So what does the Rebbe mean when he says he was never told? He was never told. Another thing, and by the way, I didn't know this till recently. At some point the Rebbe made a public service announcement, and the Rebbe the Shver said, the Frierdiker Rebbe said that Matzah Yom Kippur, everyone has to make Havdala themselves. The Frierdiker Rebbe never said that. The Frierdiker Rebbe said that the Rabbeim made Havdala themselves, and the Mamala Mokum of the Rebbe made Havdala himself. But anything the Frierdiker Rebbe told the Rebbe privately, the Rebbe made Nachas HaKlal. It's not me, everybody. The Rebbe was so careful, Chas v'Sholom, that anybody should think in any way, shape, or form that he's actually a Rebbe. So the Frierdiker Rebbe told the Rebbe Nek Havdala, so that's how you know Rabbim. And the Rebbe actually announced it in Tafshin Chav Ches. I didn't know it till very recently. Somebody asked me once, you're supposed to make Havdala Matim Kippur yourself, and I said no, and I brought it out from the reshimos. And then the next day she sent me a Sikha where the Rebbe didn't tell the story, Chas v'Sholom, but the Rebbe said that the Rebbe the Shver said, Matim Kippur, everybody has to make the honor of. But the Rebbe, this is a story, the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe knew this. He knew this. Then there's another story. That the Rabbeim used to use two esregim. The Rabbeim used to use a Yaneve esreg, as we all do, a esreg that comes from the south of Italy. But they also used it at Yisrael, the esreg. This we didn't know. It's on the reshimos it was discovered. They made a bracha dafka on the Yaneve esreg, and the story was that one year the Rebbe RaShaB could not get a Yaneve esreg. He made a bracha on the Yisrael esreg, and he cried. But the Rabbeim made a bracha on the Yaneve esreg, but they would also use an Israeli esreg for nanuim. They would get a second esreg and they do nanuim. The Frierdiker Rebbe bought for the Rebbe two esregim, a Yaneve esreg and Yisrael esreg, and he gave it to him with the younger Adam. There were three son-in-laws. The younger son-in-law was killed by the Nazis. His name was Menachem Mendel HaKoyen, Mendel Horenstein. His mother was a Schneers. He was the Frierdiker Rebbe's cousin, actually. The Rebbe bought a Yaneve esreg for each of them, and then he bought a Yisrael esreg and said to the two of them that when no one is looking, they should do nanuim. He didn't give the rashag, from what I understand. He gave the two younger son-in-laws an Yisrael esreg, which is a siman of Nesias, from what I understand. It means something. The younger one, my personal opinion, because he was Beis Rivkah, because he was a Schneerson. But I don't know. This is another case in point where the Rebbe did something. This is the Rebbe's journal. If I read it, the Rebbe knew it. You know what I'm saying? The third is fascinating. It's a fascinating thing. One morning, the Rebbe RaShaB calls the Rebbe into his room. The Rebbe walks in the Frierdiker Rebbe's room, and the Frierdiker Rebbe says as follows, quote, for the dream that I had last night, you should really put on a bottle of mashke. And he says, I was sleeping, and I suddenly saw my father in a dream, the Rebbe RaShaB. And the Rebbe RaShaB said to me, why are you so sad? Why are you so depressed? Now understand, the Frierdiker Rebbe had a lot of good reasons to be depressed. A lot of good reasons. And one of them was his own health. From the early 1930s, the Frierdiker Rebbe's health began to deteriorate seriously. And the Rebbe had to take care of his health, which limited his ability to do work. The Frierdiker Rebbe was sleeping, and he sees his father in a dream, and his father says to him, why are you so sad? It doesn't say what the Frierdiker Rebbe said, but then the Rebbe RaShaB said, why are you so sad? In your house, I'm going to use my own words, the sun is shining during the night. It's light during the night. So the Frierdiker Rebbe says, I woke up, and there was a beautiful moon coming through the window. It was gorgeous. But I knew, says the Frierdiker Rebbe to the Rebbe, that my father didn't mean lichtig banach because it's a beautiful moon. So I got up, and I started walking around the house. Nichnasti lecheder asfarim. The Rebbe tells the Rebbe, I walked into my library, and you were sitting and learning in the middle of the night. And that's what the Rebbe RaShaB meant when he came to his son in a dream and said, but dir in Stub is lichtig banacht. And then the Frierdiker Rebbe says to the Rebbe, give me rakush. Kiss me. You never heard these stories? Amazing. This is in the Rebbe's journal. Kiss me. The Frierdiker Rebbe tells the Rebbe, give me a kiss. So the Frierdiker Rebbe never uses the word I. It's always he. He's talking about himself here. So the Rebbe leaned down to kiss the Frierdiker Rebbe's hand. And the Frierdiker Rebbe pointed with his finger that the Rebbe should kiss him in the forehead. And the Rebbe gave the Frierdiker Rebbe a kiss in the forehead. This is a story which is in the Rebbe's journal, which is now in print. Anybody could read it. These are a few stories, and there may be a couple more, but these stories clearly show that the way the Frierdiker Rebbe related to the Rebbe, it wasn't just, I got 3 daughters, they had to get married, a girl has to marry a guy, so I got 3 guys in my house, and this is one of them. It wasn't that way. It wasn't at all that way. And then, of course, the stories of the Chasana, you know that the Rebbe RaShaB said I should really make a bracha Eretz Yisroel begvura, but I already made it in the morning. So he put a gartel on the Rebbe, and he said to the Rebbe, he put the gartel on the Rebbe by the chasana. Midem bin dich zu mir und mich zu dir bazelba. With this gartel, I'm tying you to me and me to you in this world and in the next world. The Rebbe put a gartel on the Rebbe, and there's a whole history, also in the Rebbe's reshimos, which the Previous Rebbe explained to the Rebbe's Ogazons and our Rebbe, that each one of the Rabbeim was given a gartel by their predecessor. The night before the Previous Rebbe passes away. By the way, there's a story that one day the Previous Rebbe was sitting in front of 770, and his Rebbetzin was sitting next to him, and the Rebbe walked by, and the Previous Rebbe says to the Rebbetzin Chaya Muzshka, Ot gate noch Tzemach Tzedek. The Previous Rebbe said, Ot gate noch behold goes noch Tzemach Tzedek. The Previous Rebbe said about the Rebbe's Ogazun, Ot gate noch Tzemach Tzedek. The night before the Previous Rebbe passes away, the Rebbe had a chavrusa with Rav Yitzchak Kutner, who was a big mistagdish Rosh Yeshiva, and in the middle of learning, the Rebbe stops, and the Rebbe says to him, there was once a grandson of the Tzemach Tzedek, who was meant to be a Rebbe, and he b'shum ma'ifin did not want to become a Rebbe, so the Chassidim pressured him, and they pressured him, and they pressured him, and they pressured him, and he had no choice, and he became a Rebbe. And the next morning, the Previous Rebbe passed away. So when the Hutta would meet Lubavitchers, and the Lubavitchers would tell him that they're very worried, that the Rebbe doesn't want to be a Rebbe, he says, it's just a matter of time. It's going to happen. I have it on good authority. The Rebbe told him the story before the Istalkus. Now, of course, Rebbe Paris wrote the Rebbe a letter right away. The Rebbe Shlita, the Rebbe walked into the Maskiris, mamish weeks after the Istalkus of the Previous Rebbe, has a letter from Avram Paris in which the Avram Paris refers to the Rebbe's Ogazun and our Rebbe. As the Rebbe's Ogazun Zayin, so the Rebbe turns around to Rabbi Chadakov and said, Cook, I'm a shugener, zogt mem shina Rebbe. The Rebbe said his name. He's crazy, he says mem shina Rebbe. So Chadakov says in his Germanic Yiddish, ich halt auch, I agree with him. So the Rebbe says, bist du eichet am shugener. And there's a whole series of steps. I don't want to tell those stories now. I just want to get to this. This story happened more than once. A Yid is walking on Eastern Parkway. A Chassidish Yid, a Satmer Yid, a Ungarische Yid. And he asks a younger man, wie wohnt the Lubavitcher Rebbe? Where does the Lubavitcher Rebbe live? So the young man says to him, why the Lubavitcher Rebbe? He says, what do you mean? He's a Rebbe, he's a tzaddik, I want to go into him, I want to talk to him, I want to get a bracha. So this man says to him, nah, you don't want the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He's young, and he's modern. When they land in college, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, you have a Satmer Rebbe, he's a big tzaddik, he's a very holy man, and then the Lubavitcher Rebbe is a moderne. So this guy gives this young man a zetz, and says, Sheigatz! Was versteist die in Rebbes? Sheigitz, what do you know about the Rebbes? Anyway, he found his way to 770, he made an appointment, he went into the Rebbe, and he realized that the person he gave him zetz in the plates was the Rebbe himself. The Rebbe asked him, what are you going to meet about? The Rebbe, I'm not a guy, I get in college. Sheigatz, was versteist die in Rebbes? When the Rebbe became a Rebbe, he said publicly to the Alter Rebbe, I'm impressed with your strength, he says. The Gemara says, the Rebbe said this, that the Gemara says that when they built the second Beis HaMikdash, the young were dancing and the old were crying. The young were dancing because they're seeing a Beis HaMikdash. The old were crying because they knew what the first Beis HaMikdash looked like, and the second Beis HaMikdash wasn't that. So the Rebbe said, you're sitting with me, and you're not crying. It's a Greiskeit von Hayazait. Rabbi Mentlik, Olav Shalom, who was a very big Chossid of the Rebbe, a big Bakusher, was good shikhi, was Purim. And Rabbi Mentlik couldn't take what the Rebbe was saying. So he says, Es ist befeichisch nicht azoi. It's absolutely not that way. It's one chain straight from the Alter Rebbe. And he got up from his seat, and he walked over to the Rebbe, and he says, I'm taking mashke from the Alter Rebbe. He put his cup out, and he says, I'm taking mashke from the Alter Rebbe. So there's a little pilpul, how the Rebbe answered him. He said, I want mashke from the Alter Rebbe, and the Rebbe gave him. Okay, that's what I think in Yud Shvat.